They said it was just a fever. That's what the doctor wrote in the file, twice. But no fever lasts 4 months, and no fever kicks inside a 10-year-old girl's stomach. By the time the midwife was called, it was already too late to hide what the family had done. What crawled out of that cabin in the Appalachian dark didn't just haunt the valley, it cursed it. And for over a century, no one dared to ask where that child came from, or who the father really was. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They lived on the edge of Breathitt County, Kentucky, where the trees grow close and the roads vanish into brush and silence. It was 1892, and the Blackburns had no neighbors for 8 miles, not by accident. The land was harsh, the winters cruel, and the stories crueler. People didn't forget what they'd heard about old Reuben Blackburn, how he lost 3 wives and buried them all behind the barn with no preacher, how his brother was found frozen to death with his eyes open and his boots missing, but what they whispered most was about his daughter. Her name was Clara, born pale, small and silent. She didn't cry when she came into the world. That alone was enough to stir talk. But it was her eyes that really set people off. One brown, one slate grey, both ringed with a strange yellow hue, like candle wax left too long in the flame. They said no one in the family had eyes like that. No one. Except Reuben himself. She didn't go to school, never played with other children. She was kept on the farm, taught to cook and clean and never speak when spoken to. By the time she turned 10, she still hadn't been to town once. But one night, in the middle of March, a knock came at the doctor's door. It was Reuben, wild-eyed, coat soaked in blood, mumbling something about his daughter being sick with the stomach. When the doctor arrived, Clara was lying on a bed of hay, her small frame heaving. But she wasn't dying, she was delivering. The midwife said the baby came fast, too fast, like it had been ready for weeks. The infant was stillborn, twisted, its mouth open wide, and Clara? She never said a word, not during the birth, not after, not for the rest of her life. What happened that night was never recorded in any official file, but the midwife wrote something on a slip of paper she kept hidden until her death. 3 words, all in capital letters. Not her fault. After that night, Clara disappeared. Not literally. She still lived in the same rotting house at the edge of the woods, but the girl everyone whispered about became something else entirely. The people who dared visit the Blackburn property said she moved differently, slower than before, like her bones didn't work the way they used to. Her skin paled even further. Her hair, once thick and brown, began falling out in clumps before her 12th birthday. But the strangest change was her silence. Clara had never been talkative, but now she didn't even respond to her own name. Reuben, however, was a different story. In the months after the birth, he became even more volatile. Drunk, erratic, cruel. He was seen shouting at no one in the middle of the woods. At one point he even locked himself in the cellar for 5 days and emerged muttering something about keeping the blood clean. And though people had always suspected things about him, now the rumors had turned poisonous. Folks began connecting the dots. Reuben's last wife, Martha, had died giving birth to a stillborn boy, one that reportedly had a twisted spine and no ears. That had been 6 years before Clara's labor, but now people whispered whether Martha was even Clara's real mother. Some said Reuben had made Clara the same way he'd made that baby, in secret, in sin, in silence. No birth certificate existed, no records of marriage, only a grave behind the barn, and a child whose eyes matched her father's. The community had one rule. If a family crossed a certain line, you didn't confront them. You simply made space, quietly. Reuben had built that space himself, miles of it. But what haunted people most wasn't just what happened to Clara. It was what began happening to the land. Fields where nothing would grow. Animals found mutilated. A boy from town who went missing after hunting near the Blackburn property, were found. And then there was the preacher's wife, who swore she saw Clara walking barefoot through the cemetery one night with a child cradled in her arms, a child no one ever saw again. By 1895, the Blackburns were no longer just recluses. They were legends, cursed ones, and in the years that followed, even the county records started disappearing, burned, misfiled, or simply erased. Like someone wanted the whole bloodline buried, not just the baby. It wasn't until 1911 that a name surfaced again: Elias Blackburn. The census taker recorded him as head of household, age 16, occupation laborer. But the town clerk noted something strange in the margin. No known parentage, said to be Clara's son, no father listed. By then, Clara would have been just 29, but the townspeople claimed she looked over 50. Her teeth had yellowed to stubs, her back was hunched, and she wore thick layers in the summer heat to hide what they called her scars. No one knew who the father was, or at least no one said. Some suspected she'd been taken again, others whispered darker things, that Elias wasn't a new child at all, but a second birth from the same unholy lineage, a continuation of a cycle that started long before anyone alive could remember. Elias didn't talk much either. He never went to school, worked odd jobs around the mines and fields, but never lasted long. Said to have a strange odor, something off about him. Animals avoided him. Children screamed at the sight of him. He wasn't violent, not outwardly, but there was a coldness to him and a familiarity. Several townspeople swore that Elias's left eye matched Reuben's perfectly, same grey ring, same waxy sheen. But by 1915, Reuben had been dead for nearly 18 years. Elias built a shack behind the original Blackburn home, using old barn wood and rusted nails. He lived alone, though townsfolk claimed they saw a girl in the window sometimes, pale, thin, unmoving. She never came outside, she never aged, and some believed she wasn't alive at all, just a memory he couldn't bury. That same year, a traveling photographer passed through Breathitt County and captured a handful of images, one of the church, one of the mountains, and one, uncaptioned, of a boy standing in front of a leaning shack. He stares directly into the camera, one hand at his side, the other clutching something wrapped in burlap. When the photo was developed, the photographer tried to recall what it was he'd seen. He said it looked like a doll at first, but then he noticed the hand, small, human, and missing 3 fingers. The photo never made it into the archives. It was pulled by the editor without explanation. But one copy remained, unearthed 90 years later by a genealogist. When the image was shared online, it was quickly deleted by the forum administrator. Reason given? Too disturbing, possibly real. In 1933, Kentucky was deep in the Great Depression, but in the hills above Jackson, the Blackburns were still barely spoken of, except in whispers and warnings. Locals said the line hadn't ended with Elias, that he'd taken a wife. Though no record of marriage was ever found, she was said to be mute, thin as bone, skin so pale it reflected moonlight. A woman from nowhere, with no family, no history, and no name anyone could remember. By the time she appeared, Elias had boarded shut the windows of his shack and hung animal bones over the doorframe. The structure sagged with mildew, rot seeped up through the floors, and still, somehow, they kept having children. 3, to be exact. 2 daughters, 1 son. None of them were registered, no doctors were ever called. The only proof they existed came from a schoolteacher who claimed she saw the oldest girl in the woods one morning, wearing a long wool dress and dragging a rope. Said the child didn't speak, just stared. When asked where her home was, the girl simply turned and walked back into the trees. But what the teacher remembered most was the girl's face, how it looked off, not in a monstrous way, but subtly wrong, as if someone had rearranged the features of a normal child and hadn't gotten the proportions quite right. Then came the house fire. In 1939, a neighbor saw smoke coming from the Blackburn shack just before midnight. By the time anyone arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. No screams, no sign of panic, just fire. After it was out, only ashes remained. Ashes and a single intact floorboard, scorched but unburned. On the underside, someone had carved 13 names, most of them unfamiliar. One was Elias, another was simply CL. But among them was one name that chilled investigators: Reborn. The coroner found no bodies, not even bones. He listed the deaths as presumed, but the report was left open, unsigned. Months later, someone broke into the town archives and tore out 5 pages from the Blackburn file. To this day, no one knows who did it, but the next morning in the churchyard, there appeared a message scrawled in charcoal on the chapel door: "The blood stays pure." In the decades that followed, the Blackburn name vanished from public record. Not a single trace, no birth, no death, no land ownership. It was as if the family had dissolved into smoke. But if you ask the locals in Breathitt County, especially the older ones, they'll tell you it didn't end. It just went deeper. A man named Chester Boyd, who worked for the electric company in the late 1950s, once told a reporter about a strange service call up near the old Blackburn land. A new structure had been built, modern, square, no windows on the side facing the road. It wasn't marked on any maps. Chester knocked on the door. A young man answered, thin, barefoot, eyes the color of stale milk. Chester asked who lived there, and the boy replied, "My mother's father built this land. We never leave it." When Chester asked if they needed electricity, the boy smiled. "We don't let the light in." No further service was performed. Chester never filed the report. He left the job 3 months later. But he wasn't the last. In 1972, a geology student from Breathitt College went missing while doing research near Blackburn Hollow. Her name was Marla Keyes. Her journal was found inside a fallen log weeks later. The last entry read, "I saw them. 2 girls, same face, same dress. They stood on either side of a stump just watching. One of them mouthed something to me. No blood left." Her body was never recovered. The town sheriff at the time, William Poe, began a quiet investigation. He reviewed the old Blackburn files, cross-referenced census records, and dug through land deeds buried in courthouse basements. What he found disturbed him enough to retire early and leave the state. Before he left, he gave one interview. When asked if he believed the Blackburn family still existed, he replied, "Not like you and me, not in the way people expect. But yes, they're still here. What's left of them remembers." To this day, Poe's notes remain sealed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In 1998, a new piece of the Blackburn puzzle surfaced, and it didn't come from Kentucky. It came from southern Ohio. A nurse named Gloria Ferrell submitted an anonymous tip to a regional genealogy journal. In it, she described a young female patient around 14 years old, admitted to her hospital under emergency circumstances. The girl was malnourished, barely coherent, and, most disturbingly, 7 months pregnant. When questioned, she couldn't recall her last name, but when shown a map, she pointed directly to a spot on the Kentucky border, an unmarked patch of woods west of Jackson, the same region where the Blackburns once lived. Gloria's most haunting detail wasn't the pregnancy, it was the girl's appearance. She had mismatched eyes, one brown, one pale gray ringed with yellow, just like Clara. She also bore scars, linear, patterned, deliberate. Not the kind made by accident or punishment, the kind that looked ritualistic. Carved into her back were 3 small symbols. Gloria sketched them and submitted them to the journal. Days later, the journal was pulled offline, the editor claiming unauthorized content had been leaked. But a few researchers saw it first. One of those researchers was a folklorist named Dr. Mitchell Langley. He'd spent 20 years studying Appalachian bloodlines, particularly isolated families with signs of generational mutation. When he saw the symbols, he recognized them immediately, not from science, but from a regional oral tradition rarely documented. The carvings matched a ritual known only in whispered legend, the womb seal, said to be performed on young girls within certain inbred clans to keep the blood from spilling too far. It wasn't a warning, it was a boundary, a way to contain something old, something sacred, or something cursed. Langley went public with his findings. A week later, he went missing. His vehicle was found burned out near Pine Mountain. Inside were torn pages from his field notes and one photo, old, cracked, and water-stained. It was the same image taken by the photographer in 1915. The boy standing outside the shack, and in the corner, faint but visible, was a second figure. A girl, half hidden in shadow, holding what looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. Her face was turned, but the eye, just one, was looking directly into the lens. It was grey. Today, the Blackburn land is overgrown, choked in bramble and moss, barely accessible by foot. No marked trails, no signposts, just a hollow silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Locals avoid it even now, not out of fear, at least not the kind they'll admit, but out of instinct. A bone-deep warning passed down through generations: don't go where the blood remembers. But once a year, always in late October, strange things still happen in the valley. Campers report hearing soft lullabies echoing through the trees. No source, no words, just a slow, rhythmic hum, like a child being rocked to sleep. Hunters find animal carcasses arranged in patterns, circles, triangles, crosses, with no sign of predator or decay, and hikers speak of sudden feelings of nausea and vertigo when they pass the old Blackburn boundary line, followed by an overwhelming sense that they're being watched. Most dismiss it as folklore, just a story, an old ghost tale to scare kids around a campfire. But there's one more piece of evidence, one that never made it into public archives, found not in Kentucky but in Pennsylvania, inside a sealed asylum logbook from 2007. A patient, female, age unknown, admitted after being discovered wandering along a rural highway, barefoot covered in ash. She was dehydrated, nearly catatonic, but physically unharmed. Her file marked her as Jane Doe. Her only words, spoken 3 days after admission, were written on a scrap of paper and stuffed into the seams of her mattress. They read, "He was my father, and my brother, and my son. I am what's left." The attending doctor listed her as mentally unstable. No follow-up was conducted. But years later, a nurse on night duty snapped a photo of the woman during a rare moment of awareness. Her face was sunken, her hair brittle, but her eyes, one brown, one pale grey, rimmed in yellow. There are some stories that don't want to be remembered, that hide in bloodlines and decay in silence, but sometimes they resurface, not for answers, not for justice, but simply to remind us that the past is never gone. It's in us, watching, waiting, and when the blood is pure enough, it begins again.